Hello and welcome to the second part of my Redux tutorial videos. Today we'll be doing a little bit more than just setting up an environment, so let's jump right in. So this is where we left off last time, setting up our environment. With Webpack, Babel, and Gulp, we were able to run tasks that allowed us to transpile Babel or transpile ES 2015 code. We used Webpack and Babel for that, bundled it together, and made it work. I also mentioned that you don't have to go this way, and you can use CS5, you can use Browserify for bundling, you can use TypeScript for bundling and transpiling, you can use Rollup.js, and you don't even have to use Gulp for task running. It's just kind of my personal preference for setting up the environment. I wanted to show you guys the minimal setup. So today, we're going to be talking about three different big things: actions, reducers, and store. So let's start with actions. So actions and action creators. So actions are these JavaScript objects that don't really have anything special about them. They're just plain objects that get passed into the store, and then the store passes it through the reducer. A lot of the parts of Redux don't really make sense until you finish kind of the loop. So whenever you start learning about Redux, you start with learning about actions. And they don't really make sense until you finish the loop. So let's just kind of walk through that little loop, the way, the cycle of working in Redux and how data kind of flows through it. When you have a view, like a React component, but you don't have to use React with Redux, by the way, just a heads up. Let's say you have a to-do list, right? So you have a to-do list and you will have these different actions like complete a to-do or add a task. When you add a task, you will fill in like an input box, right? And you press submit. In React, you will have like an on-click handler. So you do an on-click handler and you would dispatch an action. Dispatch is a function that Redux provides you with in order to send the action into the store and have it processed. So you'll dispatch this action, which is a plain JavaScript object that tells the rest of the loop like what to do, basically. For example, and I'm going to show you guys this once I show you the code, it'll make much more sense. Let's say you have that add task action, right? So you would dispatch the add task action creator, which is basically a function that returns that plain object. And you'll have like a type, and the type will basically just say in all caps, as you do with constants, that you're adding a task. And then you'll have a payload, and that payload will be that input, whatever you wanted to name that new task in your to-do. If you were completing a task, you might be passing through into this object things like the ID of the task and that you want to complete it. And that's pretty much all you would do. And that would get passed to the store. And you're thinking like, to me, when I heard this for the first time, especially with Flux, I'm like, well, that's a little bit of indirection. Why would you be doing this? But it kind of works. Once you look through the code, it actually works. So just to go through the slide, it's a way to communicate data from the view to the main reducer or to the root reducer. The way Redux works is that you have one store and you have one reducer. The reducer is, well, it'll be in the next slide. Generally, you do not mutate data. I don't even want to say generally, you do not mutate data. Whatever you pass in usually gets passed straight through into the reducer. But this is the place to put async logic. So if you do get tasks and you want to get them from the server, you would put it into this action, and you would have to use some middleware. But I'll show you guys all of that. Oh, and the difference between action and action creator: action is the plain JavaScript object. Action creator is a function that returns that plain JavaScript object. It's just a nicety. It's a nicer way to pass the data in, and I'll show you guys all of that. Reducer. So a reducer receives data from actions. So what happens is that once that action gets dispatched into the store contacts the reducer. It's a reducer, the reducer that you put in during setup, and passes in the old state, or rather the current state of the application. And think of state as just a huge JavaScript object that tells you exactly what's going on the page currently. Like, you know, you'll have a list of tasks, you'll have if the tasks have completed or not. You might have some UI things like, or UI things. Somebody recently pointed out that I say UI and it sounds funny. So you'd have these UI or UI parts of the state as well that would say something like, you know, how do you want to filter the tasks? Do you want to show the finished tasks? Do you want to show the unfinished tasks? What do you want to do? And so you get the current state, you get the data, and let's say you're adding a task, so that action will have that new task text or whatever, right? So you would basically copy the current state, you would go to that task property, and you would push in the new the contents of the new task, and then you return that, and the store gets that returned state, and it lets every subscriber know that, hey, there's a new state. That's it. The reducers are meant to have no side effects whatsoever. They're pure functions. Pure function basically means that given the same input, you get the same output, and there are no side effects. Side effects means that something outside of the function gets affected directly. A good example of that would be, let's say, something that often happens in Angular is you will have like a function that says add task in scope, and you just add the task, and it would call some scope property outside of that function and push that task into there. That's not what you want to do. You want to be given an input, you want to give it an output, and nothing else happens. Lastly, what's a store? So a store is basically the connector that connects all these different parts of the application. It's the place where your state lives, where all of your data lives, and so you pass in actions. It's usually the store is usually created with, or not usually, the store is created with reducers. So you pass in an action, it runs the reducer, it gets that response, and it notifies all of its subscribers that, you know, there's a new store or a new state. You can subscribe directly, or you can use a connector to work with React. When you work with React, there is a React Redux NPM package that allows you to connect in a much nicer way than just using subscribe. Oh, and there's dispatch. So that's kind of what you do with store. So, oh, and dispatch sends data to the store. I've talked about this. It feels like I keep repeating the same thing, and that's partially because I am. Let's remove this taskbar. It's kind of ugly. And this is what we ended up with last time. Basically just a page that let us know that all of our task runners and compilers and all this other crap worked. Now, the only thing that I've changed since last time that is not on video is I added a config file with an API key and a token that's meant to be used to contact a server. So in case you didn't know, I don't know if I mentioned this in the last video, but basically the entire application we're building is a client for Habitica. Habitica is like a gamified to-do list. And it's a really awesome way to test out new libraries and let's see if this is the password. Last time I did this, I could not get it right. There we go. It's a gamified to-do list. So what's nice about it is that you have several different types of tasks. You have habits, which are tasks that you either do positively or negatively. So if you eat a junk food, you press minus. That's a bad thing. You're trying to create a habit, so that's a bad thing. It takes some of your health. But let's say I took the stairs today, so that adds experience, and you level up. And when you level up, your health goes up. Yeah, it's like an RPG with that. Then you have dailies. When you finish those, again, you get experience and some drops. If you don't finish them, these renew daily. So if you don't finish it at the end of the day, you lose a bunch of health. To-dos, they don't have a plus or a minus. They do not renew. You just do them or you don't. You don't lose any health if you don't do them. You can just delete them. Hey, join Habitica. Yeah. And hey, let's buy some armor. That'll be fun. Anyway, I'm not going to be doing any of that. The API is pretty simple and allows you to fetch all the different tasks and then filter through them and get exactly what you want. So that's kind of why I'm using it as an example. this should give you a good visual of what we're building. Okay, so let's go back to our source. Now, I don't remember, I think that in the last video I installed all the required packages. In case I did not, here's what they are. Wait, we did install Babel. So the only things that I may not have installed last time are these 5 things down here, and isomorphic fetch. I would say this is more of a fetch polyfill for me that I'm using. Isomorphic fetch is a fetch that you can use on the backend and front end identically. React DOM to render DOM, React Redux, that's the connector I talked about, and Redux. That's pretty much it. So let's move on to our source. Ooh, I don't have the config file. I guess I deleted it. So let's go ahead and add it. We'll do config.js. Did I already exit out? No, I did not. Okay. So I created a dummy account for the purposes of this tutorial and for building out some things. I've been wanting to create a nicer front end, or rather like a more concise front end for myself for this application for a while anyway, so that's kind of where this came from. I'm typing everything out by hand because I haven't set up copy paste in my Emacs installation. So any code and anything I want to put in, I have to retype, which it's a good thing in some ways. API token, and that is what that one is. The reason I'm exposing this publicly, this API key, all this is supposed to be secret. It's just it's a throwaway. That's all. Most likely, once I'm done with the tutorial, I might delete it. 38E. Cool. So we have that, and let's look at our index.js, which is empty. All right. So we're gonna go ahead and set up a basic Redux application. We're not gonna get too much into the details of things. You'll see me often looking over this way. That's because that's where my second screen is, and I check. I like to check that everything's kind of showing up correctly in the recording, and I also want to check the code that I had already written. I've already written this application. I'm doing some live coding, but it's live coding with help. So we're gonna go ahead and just create store from Redux, and we're gonna import root. We're gonna import, what is it? Reducers. What am I doing? Root reducer from .reducers. Oh, but we don't have reducers yet, so we are gonna build those out, and then we're gonna create a store. So we're gonna create store root reducer, and that's it. So this is how you build a store. That's it. We're gonna have to we're gonna do the reducers. That's pretty much it, and then you can do store.subscribe. And I think this is the correct syntax. I could be wrong, but I believe that's what it is. If you are learning Redux for the first time and some of this stuff doesn't make sense to you, the documentation is amazing. The only qualms I have with the Redux documentation is that it tells you how to scale and abstract stuff out very quickly. And I think that makes it a little bit more confusing. You get into reducers and you're like, oh, I understand reducers, and then halfway down the page, you're already putting reducers into their own files, you're using combined reducers, and so on. I mean, it's documentation, it's not a tutorial. But it's still really useful. This is how I learned Redux. But it's just a heads up, and that's kind of why I'm creating this tutorial series. Oh, and then you can do whatever, right? And I believe that the dispatch is store.dispatch, but I could be totally wrong. We can look it up. Redux documentation. And while that's loading up, we're going to go ahead, so we just created a store. We're not doing anything with it right now, and we're going to go ahead and create actions.js. Ooh, what's that about, right? I hope this is the right one. So I tried to do this tutorial once before, a while ago, without much success. Or rather, I got interrupted right in the middle, and I was streaming live, and it's just, yeah, it wasn't pretty. Let's zoom in a little bit. All right, export. So there are a few things that go with actions. One thing I would say is that you have action types, and these are basically constants that are exported. And the reason we have these constants that get exported, we're gonna get tasks, is because first of all, storing this little string in a variable makes it much harder to mess up along the way. So like, you know, if you're like referring to get tasks and you do this, you already have auto completion. If you mess up the variable, it'll just tell you, hey, the variable's undefined, rather than, you know, if you type it in manually and you write get task and you meant to write the get tasks and, you know, you mess up along the way. So it's nice to have it this way. The other reason why we export these and write them as constants is because our reducers use it. So this is how using these action types is how our reducer is able to tell, you know, what they need to do with the current action. So let's just let's do constant tasks. So we're gonna go ahead and create an array of tasks that's gonna be stored locally. It's gonna be in a similar format as what we're gonna get from the server. Sorry, I thought I got a message. So what do we have in tasks? We have a type. So we had those daily, habit, whatever else, and we have text, which is gonna be like, you know, check Facebook. Yeah, that's a horrible to do for every day. We're gonna create like a couple of these. Type daily. We're gonna do a habit. That's gonna be. Oh, and we're gonna have a completed. False. Text is gonna for habit is gonna be I don't know, walk up the stairs. And this is a very simplified version of what we get back from the server. And we're gonna have a type habit. These types, by the way, have nothing to do with Redux. This is literally just a placeholder for the data we get from the server. And we're gonna have a, you know, finish Redux tutorial. Cool. And this is going to be completed false. Because habits don't really get completed, we're not going to add a completed on there. And let's do a completed true, just so we can demonstrate a few things. Finish Redux slides. And even though I haven't finished those, we're going to set that to true. Next, we're going to export the function creators. Or sorry, the action creators. So we're gonna export function get tasks. This is starting to look familiar, right? And here's the plain JavaScript object that we're gonna be exporting. Now the object, you can go ahead and formulate it any way you want to. There is no specific format that you are required to do. But there is a what's called, I believe it's called Flux Action Standard. Flux Action Standard, yeah. That says that you should specify type and you should specify a payload, and the payload is going to have whatever you're returning. So we're going to go ahead and return our tasks. We're also going to have a function called add task. Now, what we're going to get from that, what we're going to need our view to pass to us for our add task is the text for the task. So we know what the contents will be. Oh, and a type. Let's do that. Add task. Again, that type over here has nothing to do with Redux. It's a type of what to do. Maybe I should call it something else, but that's what they call it in Habitica. And so we're gonna return text and type, and that's pretty much it. Oh, too many. What's going on? Oh, there we go. And so those are our actions. Simple, right? It gets a little bit more interesting, a little bit more difficult once you start doing async actions. But this is kind of it, you know. You do, oh, let's do complete task, and complete task, and to complete, we'll probably need an ID. So let's just do rudimentary IDs. And since this is a very closed system, we're going to go ahead and, whenever we add a task, we're just going to look up the last task and increment the ID by 1. Complete task ID and return. Very simple, right? This is all very much semantics and boilerplate in some ways, and I think some people have been complaining about that in Redux, but this is like nothing comparison to regular Flux. And I will say that Redux is much easier to learn than Flux, and just a heads up. And I think that's one of the reasons why, it's Flux standard action, but I think that's one of the reasons why people like Redux so much. It's much simpler to reason about and think about. So this is an FSA, so you have a type and you have a payload, and then if you have an error, you have a payload and new error, and error equals true, and that's pretty much what you usually do. Again, action is a plain JavaScript object and it's a type property. These are all standards. These are more like best conventions, so it's not required, but it's recommended. Cool. This might not make, again, this is not making sense yet. You're like, why are you wrapping all this stuff? Why are you doing all this work? It doesn't make sense. So let's build reducers. We're gonna build reducers, and those are gonna be a little bit, well, those are gonna be the same thing. Wait, is there something missing? Unterminated string, what's going on here? Unexpected in a file. Did I miss a parentheses? Parenthesis, actually, since it's singular. Looks like I got everything right. Sometimes I get these like false errors from wherever. Oh, whatever. And let's jump on to reducers. Now, here is what's gonna happen. We're gonna have get tasks. Oh, let me zoom in. Add task. Complete task. So here we are actually importing all of these constants. The reason for that will be apparent in just a minute. We're going to export the default root reducer. And let's create a root reducer function. Root reducer state action. So it's recommended to have an initial state. For when your application was loading. I've noticed that people put the initial state, let me just show you this real quick, over here, so you can put it as a second argument. I usually put an empty object, but you can do null, or undefined or something. Undefined, I think, is whatever. The cool thing about doing that, being able to pass the initial state directly to the store upon loading, is that you can go ahead and use that to serialize data from the server. So whenever you're loading up a page, instead of having to fetch all this data, you can go ahead and import it. And I think people do something like, I don't know, initial data equals, and then, it's like a document that query selector all, and you might select like initial data. Oh, this looks horrible, but this is kind of like the idea behind it, that you would store it as text, as a stringified JSON somewhere in the document. You would get it, you would parse it, and then you would just throw it directly into the store. We're not going to be doing any backend stuff with Redux today or next time. I don't have it planned, so sorry. And so we're going to have an array of tasks. Now, when I was building out the original application, I split these out into the habits, dailies, and to-dos for a very good reason. But because we have the mock data currently, it works much better with tasks themselves. So first, if nothing happens, we're going to go ahead and return the state. Now, all reducers are basically built around a huge switch statement that's based on action type. Yeah, now it's starting to come together. Now, if it's a get tasks, we're gonna reduce it in a certain way, and we're gonna have a... What are we gonna have? We're gonna return a... What would be good semantics? Alright, we're gonna think about that. this is like one thing that I did differently than that I'm doing differently right now than my original idea. Complete task and default. Okay, so we're returning state. We want to affect it though. If we get new tasks, we want to make sure that what we return is the state with the new tasks. So we'll just do object.assign. One thing to note, state cannot be directly affected, so you can't do something like state.tasks equals tasks, or action.tasks. You can't do that. Like that's, I think Redux will actually throw an error that you can't affect state. What you always want to do is copy over what you had and affix the new data to that. You know, this avoids a lot of different issues that you can encounter with mutability and stuff like that. Immutability is much better than mutability in this case. So we're going to go ahead and use object.assign. Object.assign is kind of the equivalent of like object extend that a lot of frameworks and libraries use, like Lodash has extend. And what you're basically doing is you're creating a new object and you're copying over all the data from the state. So now it's not the same reference, it's different. And then we're going to do tasks equals action.payload.tasks. So what this does is basically copies over the old state, and then it copies over the tasks property with the new tasks. And that's it for the get tasks. Add tasks will be a little bit more difficult. So we're gonna create an add task reducer. We're gonna go ahead and pass in the same thing as before. And what's cool is that you can break apart all of these reducers into multiple functions. So let's see, how did I handle that before? Yeah, there we go. We're going to go ahead and just create a new state, or yeah, new state, or which is basically going to be this part, but because of the way I have to affect it. Oh, actually, I don't have to. Never mind. Let's see. Ooh, we don't need to do that. I think there's an easier way. A little bit confusing looking, but easier. So basically, what we want to do is just do the same thing as before, right? But we want to create an array with state.tasks, and we want to affix. Oh, it's a little bit more complicated. Yeah, it is. This is why you don't do live coding. Add task reducer, state action. Okay, what do we need to do? We need to create the new task. Now, a new task will have a few properties. Ooh. We'll have a type, so that's going to be action.payload. Oh, let's just do where payload equals action.payload for task. Well, actually, yeah, that's pretty much like the entire task is in the payload. Now, the one thing that we do need is to get the ID, and we also need to do task that completed equals false. And yeah, we need to get that ID. So how do we get the ID? So let's do last task, and that's going to be state.tasks. Which one is it? State.tasks.length minus 1. So what we're basically doing is getting the length of all the tasks. So it's going to be like an array, let's say, with 50 elements. We get the last element, and there it is. Again, we don't want to affect the state, so we can't do something like pop or anything like that. So that's the last task, and so the task.id is going to be last task.id plus plus. Cool. Now, what are we going to return? We're going to do object.assign. Like before, we're going to copy over the state. Like before, we're going to get the tasks. Now, we can't write over the tasks with new tasks. We don't have that. We need to copy over the old ones. And to do that, you can use a spread operator. All of these are like ES6 functions, and they're very nice to use in these instances. So you do state.tasks. The spread operator, like the ... basically just says copy over all of the different elements in the tasks array. And we can also add to that and add our new task. And if I'm correct, which I should be, this should create a new object, copy over the state, copy over the old tasks, and basically affix another task onto it, onto the tasks array. Now, if you want to, your first kind of like thought might be like, well, why don't you just use, state.tasks.push and then use spread operator to copy it? Well, you can't. Again, you can't affect the current state. You can't do state.push. You can't do state.someProperty equals whatever. You have to basically get around that. You always have to copy the state and affect that new copied state. Lastly, let's do this. Let's you know what? Let's just do this. We're gonna complete task reducer. If any of this looks wrong to you, that's fine. I'm just trying to like build something that's pretty simple to understand and reason about. What you normally do actually, instead of these add task reducer and complete task reducer, is you might have reduce task, and or you might have a reducer that deals specifically just with tasks, and it'd be like function reduce tasks state action, and inside of it you would have another switch that would actually explicitly deal with these get tasks and these different task operations. But for now, we're just gonna basically have these functions that do all this stuff for us. Alright, we need to complete a task. So how do we do that? It's not too difficult. What we need to do is actually return object.assign empty state, right? Tasks and tasks dot, let's see, what did I do last time? State.tasks.map. So we're gonna map over our tasks, mapping over effectively copies all of the properties, so you don't have to do an explicit copy. At least that's what I believe. Now we have that ID, so let's do var ID equals action.payload.id, and if ID equals task.id, we're gonna go ahead and return object.assign. So again, we're gonna copy over the old task, and we're gonna add on a completed equals true. Let me just show you guys, like, just for visualization, how object.assign works. So let's say we have an object called task, and the task has properties ID 1, type, habit, text, I don't know, run for 15 minutes because I don't know, go for a walk. That sounds better. Go for a walk. Okay. And you want to affix a new property, but you don't want to affect this object. You want a copy of this object. So what you can do is do object.assign, and these two parentheses is the equivalent of doing var empty object equals this every single time. So we're going to do empty object. This empty object is where everything gets copied to. We're going to do task. If you just left it at that, what you would get, what this would return, let's say what this would return would be basically an object with just these properties. So it copies over all these properties into this empty object. Now, let's say you want to add a new property to this task, but you don't want to set it to the task, you want it copied over. So you can do completed, true. And so not only does this task get copied over onto the empty object, the completed true gets copied over onto it as well. So I'm writing this dangerously low to the low in the editor. So this is it. This is what the object would look like before the completed true, and once you add the completed true, it just affixes a new property there. Now this object here, if you did a straight comparison between task, does it equal to this new object? Let's just do this. New object. You get a false, even if the content of the two tasks were equivalent. So that's something to keep in mind. And that's exactly what we want. That's on purpose. Now, if so, let's go back to here. So basically, if the ID equals task ID, we copied over and affixed that new completed property. If it is the same as before, we just return it. So that's okay. We don't have to copy over everything. Cool. So that pretty much does it for us. So this is the reducer. So again, let's look through the loop. We have our store. We create a store, and let's just store subscribe. Let's not do that because I'm not sure about the. Well, let's see. Oh my god, I never have JavaScript enabled. Store. Let's look at that. Store.subscribe. Where is it? Okay. So it's not a store. It doesn't work exactly how I thought. But you know, let's do this. You would do store.subscribe, and store.subscribe would get run every single time the state changes, or every single time an action is dispatched. It'll run through the reducers, and it'll spit it out. So let's just look at this, okay? And you just do store.getState, and this is where you get the actual state. Nice. Do they talk about dispatch here? Dispatch. Oh, okay. And then you have a store.dispatch, which dispatches an action. So let's say you have that add task action, and you have, my new task, add it to to-do. So this is pretty much what you would do, except we have to import the add task from actions. But that's okay, we're not going to do that. Well, we can do that. Add task from actions. So what this would essentially do is add a new task to the, it would tell the store that there's a new action. It would return that new action, which is like, we talked about it. It's type, and it's add task, but that would get translated to a string because that's a variable. You would have a payload of. So basically, by substituting the actual values for the variables, that's what I'm gonna do. And you would have text my new task and type to do. So literally this would get sent into the, this would get sent into the store. The store will take this and it'll run it through the reducers over here. So it would pass into the old state. We're just going to do this real quick. It would pass into the old state, which would be probably empty, and the new action. The action would get resolved as, oh, it's an add task. So we're going to go ahead and just go through the tasks and add a new one. And it would return that, right? We're going to do that. We're going to do it on this line and over here. Once that gets returned, the store will store it as its new state, and it will run, it will notify anybody who subscribed to the store. And when you get the new state, it's the new state with the new task. So So that's pretty much how it works. I hope that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, you start here. You create the store with the reducers. You take an action. You run that action, get tasks or whatever, and then that action gets run through the reducer. I hope all of that made sense. And again, I just showed you kind of how dispatch works. Dispatch is like the equivalent of publish. So if you think about it, Redux is pretty much a very it's a pub subsystem that has like a middleware, which is the reducer. I'm not gonna say that I know exactly how it works. Oh, I wrote form, not from. But you can actually watch the egghead.io videos. So Redux egghead.io, where Dan Abramov goes through getting started with Redux. I wouldn't call it getting started with Redux. What it really is a course that tells you how Redux works and why it was built and where to start. Yeah, so it's more of a, let me go through here and tell you why we built Redux in the first place. What is the code of it? How the code kind of evolved from the simplistic idea into what Redux is today. And again, Redux is pretty short as far as code base goes. Like if you go through here, I think somebody said it's about 100 lines. It's all split up into these neat ES6 modules. So just heads up. We can even look at create store. So what happens? Blah, 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 don't care. So yeah, you can pass in reducer or initial state into the create store. Yeah, alright, so let me just show you what I think it kind of works like, Let's say you have a service, right? Like a store service. Okay. Now let's make it a class. Okay, yeah, class, store, service. This is how basically I would implement Redux without looking at the code itself. You have a constructor, which will have reducers, and you just store those reducers. And then you have subscribe. Ooh, got a notification. And that's going to be some callback. And we're going to go ahead and just undo. This is a very simplistic idea of how I think the Redux works, right? This little class. And I think it will kind of demonstrate how you can reason about it. So we have this set reducers equals reducers, and we're going to have this that's subscribers equals empty array. Push. So we will have a nice array of subscribers. We're going to have a dispatch method, which is going to be an action. When you run that, we'll just do, let's see, this.state equals empty object, or it equals state, or empty object. It's nice. So whenever you run a dispatch, you would run something like this where new state equals this.reducers, and you would pass in the old state, which is this.state, and the action. Cool. We're actually going to do this. Cool. So this is how you get the new state, and then I would just do subscribers. For each sub, and I would just do sub. Yeah, that's it. This is pretty much this is like the simple, very, very simple version of Redux. This is all it is. It's a pub subsystem. That's kind of what it is. It's a pub subsystem that runs these reducers before it publishes the new state. Yeah. Oh, and that was the get state. So we'll do get state. and we would just do something like return, and I would just to be sure, I would pass in the state as a copy, just so that it cannot be affected. That's pretty much it, you know. It's not that complicated. This is pretty much Redux. Now all the extra stuff that's in actual Redux, the application, is a lot of, like, you know, it's a lot of stuff that helps you along, you know. If you have, you know, if type of initial state is a function and the enhancer is undefined, the initial state is equal to enhancer, you know, that's just kind of a thing, so that if you can skip putting an initial state and you can just put in an enhancer. Enhancer is a middleware. What else is here? If enhancer is undefined, is not undefined, and it's not a function, hey, enhancer is supposed to be a function. So again, niceties, you have the current reducer, current state, current listeners, next listeners is dispatching. So those are kind of like lifecycle things. Here, I believe, if next listeners is equal to current listeners, next listeners. I believe here we're just basically copying the current listeners and the next listeners. Again, you can go through the code yourself. See, get state is just get current state. So they're not even doing a copy of the state. It's just going to be the same thing everywhere. When you do a subscribe, say, you know, I subscribed true. You have the listener. We're just making sure that all the listeners work, or that you can actually copy over the listeners. We push the new listener in, and we return an unsubscribed function. So that's something that I didn't include here, being able to unsubscribe. Oh well. Dispatch. When you do a dispatch, you receive an action. Reducers may not dispatch actions. That's interesting. So I guess this is a way, by adding an is dispatching true, we make sure that a reducer cannot dispatch an action. So while we're reducing, we cannot dispatch an action. And there we go. Try is dispatching true, and current state is current reducer, current state, and action. So this is the equivalent of this line right over here. Blah, blah, blah. Then we go through the listeners, and we just run that function. I believe it could just be done with a for each, but a for loop works as well. And then you return the action. Huh. I didn't think about that. When you do a dispatch, to always return an action. Oh well. So those are things I wouldn't think about, but they're all included in the code base. And, you know, I would suggest going through this because really, you know, this is pretty simple if you think about it. I mean, that was it. That create store. That's it. That's Redux. This extra stuff here, like compose, these are utilities. You're being able to compose reducers together. You can, or compose for something else, whatever. Combine reducers. This is where you can combine reducers in a certain way. Being able to use middleware, and bind action creators. Oh yeah, this is another nicety where you're able to, instead of having to run, what did I say? Store.dispatch add task, whatever. Have it. Instead of having to run this in your code, you can just run add task, whatever. Have it. And it will automatically dispatch it. So there's a nice little wrapper for that. But again, look, this is like 20 lines, and this is Redux. This is pretty much what it is. I feel like I keep reiterating the same stuff. That's okay. The more I drill it into your heads, the better. Yeah. If you have any questions, go ahead and contact me. I do indeed have a Twitter. I have a Twitch actually as well. But I have a Twitter, so if this is going to be more of like commercial stuff, you can go ahead and exit out. I have a Twitter, you know, @njanice. Ooh, I have notifications. A little bit about me. I mentioned a bunch of stuff in the first video, but in case you skipped it, my name's Antonin. I'm a developer. I'm a writer. I have several blogs, but the two main ones are thoughtessays.com and njanice.com. I live in the Denver area. And apparently I joined Twitter in September 2009, and I have my birth date publicly available. I had no idea. I also have a GitHub where I will be publishing the code for this eventually. I should probably do it sooner than later. I do have a repository currently. My GitHub is github.com/@janus. But I have my initial application and actual working concept called HRPG Lite Redux already working. This is not the same stuff that we're working on, but this is like the prototype for what I'm showing you guys. And it looks like I haven't pushed any of it out, so I might want to do that. It looks like I might want to update a lot of different stuff, but that's kind of what it is. What did I mention? So I had that. Twitch.tv. Oh hey guys, look at that. I'm offline, but I stream all kinds of stuff. I streamed the original broadcasts on here in a little bit of a lower quality than right now. I stream just about every day at 9 p.m. UTC -7 or Mountain Standard Time if you're in the US. And I have a bunch of projects coming up soon. I'm hoping to wrap this project in Electron, and I'm hoping to work on a bunch of different stuff. So I don't know. I guess that's kind of it. Oh, yeah, definitely don't forget about my website. And if you're watching this, you're already on my channel, so no need to reiterate that. So this is my blog. Anyway, thank you for watching. Next week, or next week, next time I'm streaming, I'm gonna be handling async actions. So that's one thing, and putting everything together with React. So that's gonna be probably the last one, or like some of the finishing touches. And then the week after that, I'm gonna work on the actual finishing touches, or rather the episode after that. Yeah, thank you.